G'day. In recent days, we've just celebrated Easter, a very holy time for Christians where we remember the death and resurrection of Jesus and all the promises that God has attached to those events. However, there's a part of the Easter story that troubles me. Every time I read it, I think to myself, what on earth were they thinking? The part of the Easter story that concerns me is found in John 19, verse 15. Pilate asks the Jewish crowd, "Shall I crucify your king?" To which they reply, "We have no king but Caesar." I think the reason this concerns me so much is because it's a straight denial of God's right to rule over them. God's chosen people are rejecting God. Psalm 10 verse 16 says, "For the Lord is king for ever and ever." Every Pharisee and Sadducee who spoke those words would have been familiar with that scripture and the Jewish understanding that God is king over all the earth and the universe. In speaking these words to Pilate, they were denying their allegiance to God to his face. Let me explain. In this day and age, there are few kings. We have these days prime ministers and presidents, more of them than royal households. In the Bible times, however, rulers over certain areas were referred to as kings. With their kingship came much wealth, respect, honour and power, and they had the power to make laws and to execute justice. Even today, national leaders are respected and paid a high salary for their leadership. But unlike the kings of old, they only have power for a relatively short time before someone else takes their place, usually after an election. National leaders today are usually elected and lead as long as the people let them. Kings and queens, however, have a right to rule established many years before. For example, the English royal family have a right to rule that was established centuries ago. Battles were fought, agreements were made, and one family was given the right to rule. Queen Elizabeth II can trace her royal bloodline back to William the Conqueror, who invaded Britain in 1066. Before these agreements gave one family the right to rule, that family was just another family. In some respects, chance, circumstance, may have set the stage for that family to become more prominent than others, and tradition and adherence to ancient agreements keeps that family in power and maintains their right to rule. But what about God? Where does his right to rule come from? We see in the Bible that not only is God referred to as king in Psalm 10:16, but we're also told he is the king forever and ever, and in 1 Timothy 1:17, he's called the King Eternal. Now unto the King Eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God, be honour and glory forever and ever. Amen, writes Paul. This tells us something about God that's important to note. Firstly, that if he is the King Eternal who reigns forever and ever, there has never been a time when he was not king. Therefore, his right to rule has not been bestowed upon him by circumstance or the agreement of men. He has always had the right to rule. He doesn't need to battle for it or to ask the approval of others in order to attain it. He has the right to rule because he is who he is. God was the king before he created the universe and our world within it, and he remains the king throughout all of its history. The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, writes the psalmist in Psalm 24. As vast as the spaces of the world and the universe are, they are only a small part of the domain over which God has the right to rule. When the nations were formed and people set up their own systems of government, God was still the rightful king of their nation, whether they recognised it or not. God was king over Egypt and had the right to rule over Egypt before the pharaohs came to power. He was the king of the United States before Christopher Columbus discovered it, and he is the king over all the nations, whether they recognise that fact or not. God is not elected or appointed. He is just the king who has the right to rule because he is who he is. Isaiah writes, "For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." When we understand that God is king, we are just realising an eternal truth and getting on board with God's program. The Jewish people have a series of prayers they pray at every meal, giving thanks for the bread and the wine and the other foods that may be present at the table. Each one of these prayers begins with the same words: "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe." Clearly, these prayers show us that the Jewish people do not limit God's rulership to the earth only. They understand his dominion extends far beyond our planetary borders. God is king over all we see and more, and there has never been a time when he was not king. So when the Jews in Jesus' age say that they have no king but Caesar, it's a very frightening thing. It's a denial of who God has revealed himself to be. In the presence of their king, Jesus, they deny him. "We have no king but Caesar." These are staggeringly terrible words for anybody to utter. Only Pilate acknowledges Jesus' kingship by making a sign for the top of the cross saying, "The King of the Jews." With kingship comes authority, and kings usually delegate their authority to others to act in their name. Paul picks up this thought in Romans chapter 13, where he says there's no subject, we are to be subject to the governing authorities, and there is no authority except from God. The king's authority is not to be misused, because all power belongs to the king, Psalm 62:11, or in our case, God. And those who exercise the power of government are responsible to God for the way they govern. They are supposed to govern according to his character and his will. Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, writes Paul in Romans 13, verse 1. So what happens when a government makes evil choices? That's the time when we can resist the evil and to seek God for answers. The Bible tells us if we're going to resist evil, we must first make sure that we're submitting to the real king. "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil and he will flee," writes James in James 4 verse 7. It also tells us that the problems that we see are not as obvious as we might think, and that the evil that is in our land has other sources. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers and powers, against world forces of this present darkness, against spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places, writes Paul in Ephesians 6 verse 12. There will come a time when the King will return and put all things right. The first time Jesus came, he came to save us. His second coming will be the time when the King will put down the evil in the earth and make all things right. God is King, and through Jesus, our future is with him. The Pharisees and the people of their age may have rejected their king in favour of Caesar, but we are called to follow him always.